I was not looking for giants when I started noticing the doors. I was looking at proportion, at the old habit of state buildings to exaggerate scale in order to impress, intimidate, and turn ordinary movement into a ritual of power. That was the official language, and for a while it seemed sufficient. But the longer I stood beneath those old-world thresholds, the less theatrical they seemed. These were not only grand entrances facing public squares. They appeared inside the buildings too, in corridors, service passages, and work interiors where spectacle had no purpose. And that is when the ordinary explanation began to collapse. The first thing I did was stop reading the buildings as symbols and start reading them as tools. Symbols can afford waste. Tools cannot. If a doorway is made taller than necessary on the front of a palace, historians can call it grandeur, intimidation, theatrical statecraft. But when that same scale continues inside the building, through administrative halls, record corridors, service routes, and working interiors where no one is meant to pause and admire the architecture, the explanation begins to fail. A building speaks most honestly in the spaces where power is not performing. And those were exactly the spaces where the old world doors kept repeating. So I began measuring, not with the hope of proving anything extraordinary, but with the simpler intention of comparing human movement to architectural proportion. Again and again, the doors exceeded ordinary necessity by margins too large to ignore comfortably. 12 feet, 13 feet, sometimes more. Not exterior arches open to the weather, not ceremonial gates facing plazas, but enclosed thresholds beneath intact ceilings, still locked into the original geometry of the rooms around them. The effect was immediate. A person of ordinary height does not merely look small beneath such a doorway. He looks misscaled, like a temporary occupant using an environment that had been calibrated for someone else. The official language surrounding these features is always strangely thin. Guidebooks call them monumental. Preservation notes call them expressive. Restoration histories describe them as statements of authority, as though authority explains anything by itself. But authority explains appearance more easily than function. Government buildings still have to circulate bodies, paperwork, furniture, heat, labor, and noise. Materials cost money. Volume costs money. Every increase in height and depth requires more stone, more timber, larger hinges, heavier framing, greater effort in sealing and maintenance. To enlarge a threshold beyond practical need is one choice. To repeat that enlargement throughout a working interior is a standard, and standards always imply a user, even when the user has disappeared from memory. The pattern became harder to dismiss once I stopped concentrating on one building and started comparing many. Courthouses across America, municipal halls in South America, administrative structures in Russia, colonial offices in India. The ornament changed, the masonry changed, the political regimes changed, but the scale remained with unsettling discipline. Tall doors opened into broad corridors. Broad corridors led to oversized chambers. Those chambers connected to staircases whose rhythm felt stretched against the modern body, as if the act of climbing itself had once been imagined differently. After enough examples, the repetition stopped looking stylistic and started looking inherited, as though different governments had occupied buildings shaped by an older assumption they no longer understood. And the strangest examples were never the entrances that tourists photograph. It was the secondary sequence that stayed with me, the inner halls, the back passages, the quiet routes between offices and archives, in between waiting rooms and stair landings, between storage and supervision. Grandeur is a public language. These were not public spaces in that sense. They were logistical spaces, the architecture of daily repetition. They were built for movement, not awe. If the oversized doors were purely ceremonial, why did the ceremony continue where no audience would be there to witness it? Why does the theatricality survive in the working anatomy of the building itself? The doors also disturb every object placed around them. Handles sit oddly high. Panels appear elongated beyond familiar proportion. Frames possess a depth that makes many modern doors seem almost improvised by comparison, like smaller replacements inserted into openings that once expected something larger and heavier. In some buildings, the later modifications are almost embarrassingly visible. A reduced door fitted within an older frame, a transom added to lower the apparent opening. Flooring raised, hardware changed, steps altered. What you see is not merely preservation. You see adaptation. The architecture has been translated downward, quietly, practically, without ever admitting that the original scale may have belonged to a different body moving through it. That possibility sounds excessive until you stand in several such interiors in succession. Then the question becomes almost embarrassingly plain. What body was this comfortable for? What stride? What shoulder height? What habitual reach? Architecture is frozen movement. It records assumptions about the beings who will pass through it daily, carry weight through it, supervise from within it, and repeat ordinary gestures there for generations. A plaque can be rewritten. A restoration note can be softened. But a threshold preserves its allegiance with a stubborn honesty. It either fits the body using it, or it remembers another one. By then, the doors were no longer isolated curiosities. They had become the first visible layer of a larger mismatch. Once noticed, they pulled my attention toward stair rails, set strangely high, waiting rooms whose volume felt operationally, excessive desk inventories that survive at awkward scale, and corridors whose breadth made little sense for ordinary clerical life. The doorway was not the whole mystery. It was the point of entry into one, a scaled opening into a scaled environment, and the environment kept suggesting the same unbearable possibility. These buildings were not designed to overwhelm us symbolically. They were designed to accommodate someone else with complete practicality. I began searching out old photographs of these interiors whenever I could find them. Not the polished images selected for official histories, but the dim archival views taken before restoration, before electrical retrofits, before tourism turned every surviving chamber into heritage. In those photographs, the doors seem even stranger, because the rooms around them are still honest. Cabinets stand low beneath the openings behind them. Clerks and attendants appear swallowed by the height. In some frames, a single open doorway becomes a dark vertical cut so tall that the person crossing it looks less like the intended user than a figure passing temporarily through a world that had already been built to another measure. The practical objections only multiplied. Larger doors require more material, stronger hinges, deeper framing, greater thermal loss, and more volume to regulate across the whole building. Empires certainly spent lavishly, but waste behaves selectively. Decoration concentrates where power wants to be seen. Here the excess runs deep into the places where administration unfolded, where records moved, where orders were carried, where oversight became routine. That is not how ornament behaves. That is how systems behave. And the moment I began reading the doors as part of a system, the rest of the architecture shifted with them. The corridors no longer looked dramatic. They looked proportional. The ceilings no longer looked aspirational. They looked necessary. I was no longer asking why old doors seemed oversized. I was asking why so many buildings, in so many countries, preserved the same excess where practicality should have corrected it first, and why history keeps calling that practical excess style when the stones themselves suggest otherwise. That was the point where the doors stopped feeling like curiosities and started behaving like witnesses. A witness does not need to explain itself. It only needs to remain consistent while the stories around it keep changing. The more I compared those oversized thresholds with the language used to describe them, the more I noticed the same institutional reflex. Acknowledge the feature, classify it as style, and move on before the practical question can form. The question itself seems to make people uncomfortable, not whether the doors are large. That is obvious. The discomfort begins when you ask who moved through them naturally, without being diminished by their scale. Once that question appears, other evidence begins gathering around it with unsettling speed. Photographs from the mid to late 19th century show men, and occasionally women, whose height against ordinary surroundings seems difficult to accept at first glance. Not paintings, not folk tales, not circus illustrations softened by myth and repetition. Photographs, cabinet cards, carte de visite, formal studio portraits in which the grain matches, the lighting holds, the clothing falls correctly, and ordinary people stand nearby in ways that make casual dismissal harder than it should be. The first instinct is always to isolate them, to treat each image as a trick, a medical exception, a novelty. But what stays with me is not just the scale, it is the normality of the presentation. True anomalies are usually framed as anomalies. They are labeled, advertised, explained, made into events. Yet in a surprising number of these images, the unusually tall figure is not staged as a spectacle. He stands with composure. He wears formal clothes. He occupies the frame with the stillness of someone who belongs there. Sometimes he appears with family members of ordinary height. Sometimes with officials. Sometimes in contexts that suggest duty, ceremony, supervision, or guard work rather than entertainment. The camera does not behave as if it is recording a monster. It behaves as if it is recording a person whose existence still made sense within the social world around him. That muted normality appears elsewhere too, in the way archives and institutions handle these traces. They rarely refute them dramatically. More often, they soften them. A photograph becomes miscellaneous. A mention becomes unverified. A figure of unusual stature becomes a pathology, a curiosity, a rare deviation not worth connecting to anything larger. And the same habit appears around the architecture. An oversized door becomes monumental style. A too large chair becomes decorative furniture. A massive tool with obvious wear becomes industrial equipment. Each object is reduced separately. Each explanation is small enough to feel safe. And once everything has been reduced one piece at a time, the pattern vanishes behind the labels assigned to it. But patterns do not disappear simply because the vocabulary around them has been disciplined into silence. The giant photographs cluster in roughly the same historical atmosphere as the buildings that trouble me most. The 18th and 19th centuries, especially the period when administrative construction expands across empires, colonies, and new bureaucratic states. The doors belong to recent history, not to some unreachable prehistory where missing records would be expected. They stand in structures that should be documented, discussed, and fully legible. Yet their practical scale remains curiously underexamined. At the same time, visual traces of unusually large human beings appear often enough to form a motif, then gradually recede into dismissal, embarrassment, and forgetting. The newspapers deepen that discomfort. Again and again, in the 19th century and into the early 20th, reports appear describing giant skeletons uncovered in mounds during rail excavation, in organized burial sites, in places where the dead seem not accidental but intentionally arranged. Individual cases can always be challenged. Misreporting exists. Sensationalism exists. Exaggeration exists. But that objection misses the larger point. The significance is not that every report must be accepted literally. The significance is that the reports recur with the same rhythm as the photographs and the architecture. They belong to the same field of possibility, and then they fade under the same pressure of institutional forgetfulness. Silence is not the same thing as disproof. I keep returning to that distinction because it defines almost everything about this subject. If the doors meant nothing, scholars could answer the functional question directly. If the photographs were trivial curiosities, museums could display them with confidence beside their preferred explanations. If the skeletal reports were nothing but error, the chain of correction would be easy to trace. Instead, what appears again and again is not resolution, but administrative softening. Labels replace inquiry. Categories replace synthesis. The building remains visible, the body becomes doubtful, and the relationship between them is treated as something one should not connect too confidently in public. That is where the giant hypothesis becomes useful, not because it flatters fantasy, but because it restores practical logic to evidence that otherwise remains awkward and unresolved. A 12-foot interior doorway stops looking absurd if the people using that building included officials, guards, overseers, or specialized workers far taller than modern humans. The surrounding spaces begin to settle into coherence as well. Corridor width, ceiling height, stair rhythm, railing placement, chamber volume, even surviving furniture proportions stop reading as waste and start reading as accommodation. The question changes. It is no longer why builders exaggerated so extravagantly. It becomes why later generations insisted those accommodations had no intended user behind them. From there, the larger implication becomes difficult to avoid. What if later, governments inherited parts of a built world they did not originally design? What if they occupied structures already standing, reused them because stone outlives memory, and then slowly adapted them to smaller bodies and smaller explanations? That would account for the visual tension still present in so many interiors. Old frames carrying reduced doors, altered floors, patched thresholds, resized hardware, awkward transitions between incompatible scales. The building survives by being translated downward. The narrative survives the same way. Its former users become anomalies. Its furniture becomes decoration. Its tools become curiosities. Its architecture becomes style. Everything remains, but only after being linguistically reduced. And that, perhaps, is why the doors still stand in plain sight. They are too useful to abandon, too expensive to replace completely, and too familiar in daily life to force most people into asking foundational questions. We pass through them after adaptation, not as intended users, but as inheritors. Courts still function in them. Ministries still occupy them. Museums preserve them. Railway buildings repurpose them. The structures continue serving modern institutions while quietly retaining proportions that do not belong comfortably to us. The strangest fact is no longer that such doors were built. The strangest fact is that we have trained ourselves to move through them without curiosity, as though visible mismatch were less troubling than the possibility that the past has been simplified beyond recognition. I keep returning to the same image, an ordinary person crossing an extraordinary threshold with complete indifference, as though the building were not speaking around him. Maybe that is what these old-world doors are doing. Not proving, not declaring, not shouting, but remembering. Remembering a scale, remembering a user, remembering an arrangement of human life that later history found easier to classify than to confront. The doors remain, the photographs remain, the reports survive in fragments, the institutions remain cautious, and beneath all of it, one question keeps waiting with a patience that feels almost architectural in itself. If these structures were not originally built to fit us, then who exactly were they built to fit? And what else disappeared when the people who matched their scale were written out of memory?